that concludes our action portion of the agenda. We'll move into the information and discussion items. We're on agenda item number 7, Transportation Planning Discussion Series, Economic Vitality. Mr. David Fletcher, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Share my screen here. So this topic, again, is part of the transportation discussion series. You can find more information in the memo in your packet on page 23. And just a quick reminder, the discussion series is really aimed at building a deeper understanding of topics that are relevant to SRTC's planning activities, in particular, the unified list of regional transportation priorities and its development process, which Eve is going to speak about next. But before getting into that, I wanted to really quickly give a quick refresher on this discussion series and where we're at and where we've been. So we started back in January going over the MPO purpose, then a number of different topics were discussed, including the Transportation Technology Panel last month. And for the remainder of the year, the next steps will involve updating that unified list. So this is the final topic in the discussion series. Back to the unified list, though, if you'll recall from last year's update process, part of it involved identifying project evaluation criteria, which you can see in the table here in the colorful columns. And just to take a quicker look at that, or more in-depth look at that criteria, it was based around the guiding principles in Horizon 2045, the region's metropolitan transportation plan. So in addition to economic vitality, those include stewardship, safety and security, quality of life, operations, maintenance, and preservation, as well as cooperation and leadership. So to take a closer look at economic vitality and the criteria around that in last year's unified list process, since that's the topic today, we looked at a number of different factors. We looked at whether or not a project was located on the regional freight priority network, whether or not it provided access within or between regional activity centers, and whether or not it increased redundancy in areas of limited connectivity throughout the region. So in reevaluating that criteria for this year's update process, we started by taking a closer look at the actual guiding principle language in Horizon 2045. And this is a lot of text on the screen, but this next slide paraphrases kind of those key points that are in that guiding principle. So first, a focus on people, freight, and goods movement to improve the regional, national, and global competitiveness of SRTC's planning area. Then also to enhance accessibility and connections to economic activity centers in the region, and to prioritize multimodal investments. And then along with that principle are a set of economic vitality policies in Horizon 2045 that relate to those key points. So first, to prioritize transportation investments by mode, then enhance accessibility and connections between city centers, regional centers, attractions, towns, and areas of regional employment. So getting at those regional activity centers that I'll get into in a little more detail later. And then to support areas of potential economic development. So looking forward to the future and where that potential exists and what might be critical there. And then last, to support the efficiency of freight movement in the region. So I'll go through each of those in a little more detail and discuss kind of how SRTC has evaluated those and measured them in the past. Starting with that first piece in the regional activity centers. So those are identified in Horizon 2045 as areas of regional significance with high concentrations of employment. And you can see them on the map here on the right. And there are 4 different types that we identify in Horizon 2045. The first 3 are transit, freight focused, and then a mixed focus activity center. And then the last type is a local activity center. And those first 3 are determined based on the composition of the employment and the sectors of that employment in the activity center. So for transit centers, those have primarily commercial and service and office sector jobs. So places like the Central Business District in Spokane and the Sprague and Division corridors are examples of the transit focused activity center types. And then the freight focused activity centers, those have more of a focus on industrial and manufacturing and other freight related employment types. So you can see out in the West Plains by the airport, the Spokane and Spokane Valley industrial areas, those are examples of our freight-focused activity centers. And then we have the mixed focus, which Liberty Lake's an example of that, but an area that has a pretty balanced composition of those freight and transit-oriented employment sectors. And then the local sectors, you can see Medical Lake's an example, the Palouse towns, Deer Park, those are small towns or rural areas, and those are areas that, while they don't have the employment scale of those regional activity centers, they have a significant concentration that's more localized and has more of a rural or small town focus. And SRTC uses those activity centers to help us evaluate the impacts of projects throughout the region in areas that have a really significant economic impact on the region, and they're critical to the economic vitality of the region as a whole. So this idea of economic activity centers gets at a key concept to economic vitality in our region, which is connecting jobs and housing. And you can see in these two maps, the one on the left shows our employment density throughout the region, and the one on the right shows our housing density. And you can see the employment density in green, it's really concentrated around those regional activity centers and downtown along the major corridors. And then you can see with housing, it's more spread out evenly throughout the region, especially throughout the urban area in the region. And what that kind of gets at is that in our region, like many regions, there's a bit of a disconnect between where housing and jobs are located. And a lot of that is by design, some not, but that disconnect ultimately does put a strain on the transportation system, of course, and connecting the jobs and the housing in the region. So this next series of maps, this shows our forecasted employment density and housing density in the region that was done for Horizon 2045. So this is what we're projecting it to look like in 2045. And you can see similar patterns, increased density due to growth, but not a huge difference in those overall patterns. And this gets at that second principle that Horizon 2045 discusses related to economic vitality, which is those areas of potential. What areas do we project employment growth moving forward? So this last set of maps, this shows just that, the growth that we're projecting between 2019 and 2045 in the region. So you can see the projected new jobs per acre on the left here with the circles representing the activity centers, and then the projected households or housing units on the right here. So you can see based on this that while there are some areas where that growth overlaps, like the Central Business District, you have quite a bit of housing growth and employment growth. There are other areas like the Division Street corridor where there's a lot of job growth, not a lot of housing growth though. So what that ultimately indicates is the potential for that disconnect between jobs and housing, and that strain on the transportation system, of course, to potentially increase as time goes on. So one of the strategies that Horizon 2045 outlines to address that issue moving forward is the identification of regional priority networks for freight, vehicles, bicycles, and transit, which really identify those key routes that are critical to the region's transportation system in connecting those jobs and housing and providing access to those regional activity centers. So what are the critical transportation routes and corridors and facilities is really what they're identifying. And in particular, I want to take a closer look at freight because that's mentioned quite a bit in Horizon 2045 in the discussion of economic vitality in the region. So our regional freight priority network, it includes Tier 1 and Tier 2 FGTS routes, which is a state classification for freight routes that I'll get into in the next slide. It also includes truck freight economic corridors, which is another state designation, but it gets at those first and last mile connections to those major freight generators that are primarily located in the activity centers. And then also some high priority truck routes that are identified in the Inland Pacific Hub study that SRTC and its partners did a number of years back. And then major rail lines and air facilities. So the FGTS or freight and goods transportation system, again, that's a state designation that I wanted to touch on as well, because it takes a little bit different approach to looking at the critical freight routes, not only in our region, but statewide. But it looks at the volume of freight that a facility carries, and it identifies those Tier 1 and Tier 2 routes that carry the most freight in our region and are part of our regional freight priority network. But it also looks at other routes that don't carry quite as much freight, but still carry quite a bit of freight throughout the region. So it identifies Tiers 3 through 5 as well. Again, based on the tonnage of freight that moves on those corridors. So you can see those routes on the map on the left. One last thing I wanted to touch on is just our economic vitality indicators. And this is a list of some that we've used in the past or looked at in one way or another here at SRTC. It's not a comprehensive list of everything that could be looked at to evaluate a project's economic vitality and impact on the regional economy, but it's some of the ones that we've looked at in the past. So things like access between and within activity centers, current and projected employment densities, those regional freight networks and freight volumes and tonnage, as well as others that require a bit more in-depth analysis. But things like jobs created and the types of jobs created as well by a particular project. So this last slide, it just wraps back to the unified list criteria that I mentioned to start the presentation. So on the left, you can see the criteria we used last year. Access between or within those regional activity centers. Is a project located on the regional freight priority network? And does it increase redundancy in areas of limited connectivity? And then on the right, I have the proposed criteria that we're looking at for this year's unified list update. And Eve will go into that in a little more detail in her presentation next. But this is really looking at both our review of Horizon 2045 and its policies related to economic vitality, as well as trying to the best we could take into account the feedback we heard from the TTC and the TAC last month when we presented this topic to them. So we're looking at including, like last time, the access to local and regional activity centers. But in addition to that, we want to take a little bit more in-depth look at what a project is, and does that particular project relate to the activities in a given activity center. So is it a transit supportive or active transportation project in those transit focused activity centers, or is it a freight project that's connecting and providing access to freight activity centers? Then additionally, we want to look at, add a new criteria this year, looking at the forecasted employment density. That's a typo there, sorry. But that should read employment density of the transportation analysis zone. So our forecasted employment density within a quarter mile of the project is what we're looking at. And then the last one is looking at that freight and goods transportation network, or FGTS classification, and looking at projects that are located on that network and looking at the actual amount of freight that they're moving. So this is our initial proposed criteria. And what we like now is just to get the board's feedback on this proposed list of criteria, get any thoughts on anything else that maybe we should be considering, anything we shouldn't be, or any other thoughts that the board has related to economic vitality and how we look at that here in SRTC. So with that, I'll turn it back to the board.
Thank you, David. With that, as David's requesting, do any board members have any thoughts, comments, questions regarding the criteria for the economic vitality segment? Commissioner French has his hand up.
So the data that you are basing your work on, I saw that it was the 2019 data, which is now 3 years old, and about 6,500 employees short of being accurate, and it doesn't show as a rail the new transload facility that's going to be opening up this fall on Craig Road. So any thoughts about updating the data so that as we make decisions, projections, we can at least have a reliable set of data that reflects what's out there now, as opposed to what was out there before all of this recent development has occurred?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a good point, because a lot has changed in the last 3 years since our last official base year update. So I would respond with, I guess, 2 parts. The first is that we're currently in the process of updating that base year data set. I don't know that we'll have it ready in time for the unified list to use that, but at the same time, we will also be looking at our forecasted employment. So we're looking and hoping to capture what's occurred and what's going to occur in the future, not just what was there in 2019, as we look at a project and its impact on economic vitality.
Who's going to be doing the forecasting?
We've already completed that forecast. That was the forecast that was adopted as part of the Horizon 2045 MTP update.
Or the forecast is outdated by data that would be significant influence about decisions that we're being asked to make then.
David, how do we update the data then again?
We, in the past, SRTC has updated its employment and population forecasts with the Metropolitan Transportation Plan updates. So it's something that's been done every 4 years with that update. And again, it's something that we're in the process of updating now in advance of that next MTP update. But it is a process that takes a while.
Go ahead. Lois, is it?
Go ahead. I was a while. Give me a timeline. What is a while? I guess I'm asking.
We anticipate updating our land use as part of the data project, and I believe, I don't have the exact date in front of me, but I believe it's at the end of the year, and then it would go through a process, though, being actually adopted as part of the MTP update that's scheduled for, I believe, 2 years or so out. So it's something that's in the horizon a little ways.
As a question or comment?
A comment. So when it comes to updating the long-range plan, going through that comprehensive sort of aggregate forecast, and there are certain rules we have to follow in doing that. That's a challenge if we were trying to update that annually. Whereas we want to update our unified list annually because we want that to be current and reflective of our existing priorities. So a forecast should not ideally change dramatically year over year, a long range forecast. That being said, what I hear, and I'm happy to have somebody follow up on that, is as we go through this process, at least in evaluating projects, we need to try to figure out a strategy for pulling in more current data so that we're not taking that 3-year-old forecast that was developed with 4-year-old information, and we have a way to sort of update and maybe reflect some of the changes that happen year over year, especially in an environment like this where we have so much going on. So we will take that forward, David, and we can talk with our technical committee in particular and see if there isn't a way to introduce into this process a way to update some data with regards to the economic vitality attribute to make sure that we're reflecting growth that perhaps has been identified since the long range plan update. We'll talk about ways we can do that.
Does that work, Commissioner French? I know it's a good point. It's outdated. We intend to update it, and it would be through our own staff. Is that what I'm hearing on that data? That was the other part of this question.
Well, at the end of the day, we're pulling information from whoever the project sponsor is. So we're not always generating all of the information on our own, but a lot of what we get is information that we've had as a part of the long range plan update. But when we receive project applications and information, we get that from the project sponsors, and it is more current. So if there's a way to sort of forward up some of that data, we can figure out a way to do that.
All right, any other board members?
Mr. Gribner has his hand.
We're good. Mr. Gribner, good to see you today. You have the floor.
Good to see you as well. Sorry I'm late. David, a couple quick questions for you. I guess maybe an assumption on my part, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. It is the intent on the unified list to rank the work, correct?
Yeah, to assign a score to each of the projects based on the criteria.
So it might be good for the board, and I don't know if you've thought through this far yet, but help us understand how the criteria turns into a ranking or a score. Because the criteria at this point, is sort of undefined in terms of how you're going to translate that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I can see how that it could be a little abstract when it doesn't have that detail. I know Eve's going to go over that in the next presentation, so it's on the agenda. So I don't want to take too much from her, but essentially each of these will have a points value assigned to it. Some of those are binary, just yes, no, doesn't meet the criteria. Others, like with the FGTS classification, where we have a tonnage amount, it would be scaled based on the tonnage amount.
Okay, I'm sorry, Eve, I didn't know you were going to cover it, so I can wait. So thanks, David.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Gribner. Any other thoughts or comments? Looking for hands. If I don't see any, we'll move on to the next item. Very good.